So to make things flow with as few interruptions as possible, we're going to ask folks to turn off your audio. And if you have questions during the conversation, please place them in the chat. We have a really full conversation planned and a really remarkable panel. So I don't know how many of those audience initiated questions we'll get to, but we will certainly try. And in kind of further acknowledgement that this is really an enormous conversation that we know we won't be able to hold in its entirety, we want to let you know that the EAC Equity Across the Curriculum initiative, of which I'm part, and who we are hosting today, we're exploring a potential follow-up event that might be more peer-to-peer focused and workshop based. So please keep an ear and eye out for that offering. And Doctors Chingy Chin and Neil Simpkins, my colleagues whom I'll be introducing shortly, are also planning a one-day symposium based on their research on trans and gender expansive students, which you'll get to hear a bit about today, but there's more coming. So just to signal that we can't and we won't hold it all, but we know these issues are pressing and we're working to offer more spaces for folks on campus. Okay, so we here at Bothell are really the funnel for this enormous kind of tidal swell of activity happening nationally. And so I wanted to name some of that context and then describe a bit about our campus before diving in. So many of you will be familiar with the Trump administration's executive orders targeting trans and gender expansive people, as well as lawsuits against these orders. These include one filed here in Washington State with the support of 100 trans youth signatories, one of whom, Luna Krohn-Baron, who we have on our panel this morning, was a signature of. In addition to these measures, we've seen the arrest of a trans woman in Florida for using the bathroom, the disappearance and attempted management of gender-engaged research, the threat of the criminalization of those supporting trans youth, the targeting and exclusion of trans athletes, trans families migrating or contemplating migration because of fears for their safety, trans and gender expansive scholars, artists, and activists being denied entry at the US border, the elimination of the X marker on US passports, and detention of trans and gender expansive travelers, including US citizens. And obviously this list is partial. It intersects with other executive orders and actions that are putting other minoritized communities at risk, including migrants, green card holders, and student and labor activists. And so while there's a focus on trans and gender expansive student needs today, we're mindful that these intersect with others, and we have a broad and deep panel that can speak to those intersections. So with the laser-like focus of this administration on higher education, we want to think through what this context means here on our campus. And I just wanted to say a few words, in part as orientation for our panel, about our campus, because we have a kind of singular learning community that bears on these questions. So many of our students we're a minority serving suburban satellite campus of the University of Washington. Many of our students are first-gen college students and first and second-generation migrants. We also have large numbers of international students. Our campus is working class. And while the number of traditionally aged students living in residential halls continues to rise, we are essentially still a commuter school. And so that context shapes how we experience these issues and the needs of our students. It also is important, as I understand, because most of the research on these questions is focused on R1 residential campuses. So we have to do some creating within our own context. So I am going to begin by inviting my colleagues, Neil and Chingy, to share about their research about the experiences and needs of trans students on our campus. I'd like to share a little bit more about them. And again, I'll be expanding on our panelists as they come into the conversation. Chingy Chen uses they, them pronouns. They're the author of Recombinant, The Heart's Traffic, and a co-editor of The Revolution Starts at Home, Confronting Intimate Violence Within Activist Communities, and a massage parlor organizing project core member. They have served as an Alphabet Alliance of Color mentor and collaborated with Neil Simpkins on the Imagining Trans Futures cross-disciplinary research cluster. After their trans and non-binary reading room at the 2023 Asian American Literature Festival was canceled by the Smithsonian, they organized the Reorienting Reads Collective to amplify diasporic Asian and Pacific Islander, transgender, intersex, non-binary, and gender-expansive voices through community events, educational resources, and publishing projects. Chen is currently an assistant professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences and the MFA program in creative writing and poetics here at Bothell. And Neil Simpkins uses he, him pronouns, is a teacher, scholar, writer, working at the intersections of disability and trans identity. His current book project, Accommodation Work, The Rhetorical Practices of Disabled College Students, examines how the current system of accommodation in higher education shapes disabled students' experiences of college. Neil is an assistant professor in the School of IAS here at UW-Bothell, and I'm so happy as always to share space with the two of you. So you all have been doing work on these questions, really specific to our campus. And so I wanted to invite you in to share about how trans and gender expansive students feel a sense of belonging here at Bothell. What are the challenges faced by UW-Bothell trans students? And what is the impact of being a trans student on academic success, social, emotional well-being, and extracurricular activities? Neil and Chingy.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having us here to talk about this. I'm going to kick us off with just a quick kind of background to the study, and then we're going to swap off responding to some of those questions. So as you mentioned, the context for our university really led us to see a need for gathering knowledge and understanding this experience. Our project kind of grew out of what we saw from the 2019 climate survey here at Bothell that had some really interesting responses from trans students, but had very little data in general. Like not very many trans identified students took the survey. The ones who did, there were only a handful of responses. But from that, we when the opportunity arose with the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with the fellows program they rolled out this year, we thought this would be a great opportunity to build on some of the work that we've been doing and create a study where we interviewed students in focus group format, kind of learned about their experiences on campus. We kind of are wrapping up our data collection right now, so we're about to move into analysis, but there's been some really, really fascinating things that have emerged from what we've learned. We also really specifically framed our questions around belonging, in part because that's a core value of the work that we do here at Bothell. And the sort of wide range of responses around that were very interesting. Yeah, so I'll let Chingy get going with some of the things we've found so far.
Yeah, so one of the things has been mentioned that even though we're moving towards more residential, we are very much a commuter campus. And so what happens in the classroom really matters for the students' experience of campus, because they may not have access or care about other parts of campus life in the way that they might if the majority of students lived on campus or participated more fully in extracurricular activities. So I think that students really recognized and appreciated when there was a trans faculty member in the classroom or when they interacted with the trans staff member. So the responses really widely varied, but and also, they really appreciated when there was trans representation in the curriculum. So it really varied and widely across schools. So some students did have access to that, and some students didn't interact with that at all, and didn't interact with any trans faculty members or staff like throughout their experience. What they said was, even if the faculty member isn't trans, that it was really helpful when faculty members shared about where they were coming from, situated their social identity, and shared about their identities for the students so that they felt more empowered and more comfortable to share about their identities. One caveat was to not expect students to be the trans token. There was one student who talked about how a faculty member asked them to talk from the transgender zone, and it was really uncomfortable for them. So I think, there's definitely some mindfulness in how to ask students to share about their experiences. Pass to you.
Sure, yeah. So I'll be talking a bit about some of the ways that students were feeling that they did not belong, or things that happened to them that shaped that experience. So many students did report being misgendered in the classroom, especially feeling frustration around that because there are infrastructures here for indicating your preferred name and pronouns. This actually happened less with peers. I think that actually can speak a little bit to the fact that, most of the students at Bothell come from the Seattle area, so they have a vocabulary around that maybe other more larger institutions don't have, but still having some struggles with that with faculty. And it also was more impactful, when a faculty member would misgender or use the wrong name. And in general too, there's still a lot of work to be done about like the infrastructure for supporting trans students here. For one example, some of our interfaces don't like necessarily take up that information that students indicate to it. So a student had an experience with housing where where the incorrect name, their dead name, was shared, like was kind of on this email, and they learned later that their roommate had learned it, and so there was this sense of not having like control of that information. And also students really appreciated like the gender neutral facilities that are available here on campus, but because they weren't designed like when we first started our school, they're kind of in the newer buildings, and that can create this sort of maze that students are trying to access on our relatively small campus. So it makes it a little bit more pressing. I find that a little bit telling too, because one of the things that's also true about our school is it's very young, like it's about 35 years old at this point. So, we didn't build that in, even though it's a newer facility at the time. Additionally, I'll just note that Cascadia has the same, we have a community college that we share our campus with that has the exact same like building plan for their buildings. And in that space, they have designated gender neutral restrooms and kind of worked around that particular structural issue through just putting up signs. So, and installing like a lock on some of the doors. So there are ways that we're not really like creating that space with what we have, and even compared to our sister campus next door. Yeah, so I'll pass it back over to you.
And the last thing will say, just to close out this, this part, is we did ask students, like the last question, to give advice to other trans students, and if they would recommend our campus to other trans students. And all of them actually said yes, which we were a little surprised about. And one of the reasons is that the kind of campus mattered to them. Several people mentioned the smaller size of our campus as being really important to them, including smaller class sizes. And that made sense in terms of asking, what made them feel more comfortable or what made them feel belonging. And it was the classes which were more interactive, where they got to know their classmates and faculty better and had a more intimate sense of campus life. Those are the experiences where I think, as mentioned before, they felt more comfortable sharing about their identities. And even if people didn't feel like it was important to them, they did indicate that it was important in terms of campus life to have clubs and organizations and services that were more oriented for being inclusive of trans students. And then some of the challenges are that our campus doesn't have an LGBTQ center. We don't have a health center, and there are very limited resources with a counseling center. So there's challenges in terms of finding support. Thank you, and looking forward to hearing what the rest of the panelists have to say.
Thank you, Neil and Chingy. I appreciate you distilling what I know is like this large body of research that I've gotten to hear a bit more about because we're ODEI fellows together, but I look forward to the campus getting to learn more too through the planned symposium. So thank you so much. I know we'll be drawing on your knowledge as the conversation continues. So we'd like to kind of bring in our panel to these questions about student experience. I'm going to name our panelists, and then as they come into the conversation, again, I'll present more about their bios and roles and commitments as they come in. Panelists, please feel free across this conversation to speak to these issues kind of at whatever scale you feel called to. So that could be about the needs of trans and gender expansive students in general, or it could be in view of the present moment. So just so our gathering has a sense of who's here, I just want to name that we will be hearing from Dean Spade, he, him, a professor at Seattle U of School of Law. Many of you will be familiar with his work. Jorge Albaron, who is elected member to the Metropolitan King County Council in November 2023 and is serving as representative for District 4. And then Luna Kronbaron, she, her, a drama student at UW Seattle. And I think we can say also Jorge's daughter. I felt really moved by the ties of kinship that are present on this panel, and some visible and some invisible. I know that there are deep relationships binding a lot of folks here to folks in the room. So thank you for being with us. I'm going to open it up to you all and then kind of invite particularly Luna and Dean. What do you see as the most pressing challenges facing trans, non-binary, and gender expansive individuals in education and the workplace today? What is the impact of being a trans student on academic success, social, emotional well-being, and extracurricular activities? And so this is a little bit of a recursive loop, but let me now just give you a bit more knowledge about our wonderful panelists. Dean Spade, again, professor at Seattle U School of Law, has been working in movements for queer and trans liberation, anti-militarism, and police and prison abolition for the past 25 years. He's the author of Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law, and Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next. The director of the documentary Pinkwashing Exposed, Seattle Fights Back, and his new book is Love in a Fucked Up World, How to Build Relationships, Hook Up, and Raise Hell Together. We're so delighted to have you, Dean. And Luna, again, drama student at UW Seattle. Luna has firsthand knowledge of the experience of living as a trans person in Washington as a student and in the UW system. She is a lifelong advocate and organizer for transgender rights and human dignity. Most recently, in February, she was part of the AGO's lawsuit against the Trump administration's executive order targeting transgender and gender diverse youth, contributing to the supporting declarations for the lawsuit. So thank you both so much for being here.
You want to start, Luna?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for this question. This is a very wide-reaching question, and the most pressing challenges facing trans and non-binary and gender expansive individuals in education. And I can really only speak from a very personal level. As a trans person in the UW system, I think what I can speak to in terms of how transness and being a trans student affects academic experience is that we live in a time as trans individuals in which our human dignity, our right to exist feels constantly under threat, is constantly under threat. And this enters every sphere of life. Um, uh, we see the ways in which infrastructures in education are, and especially in higher education, are not fully supportive of trans students, but even beyond that, just existing as a trans student, and trying to balance being a student whilst you kind of are living in this constant fear, constant sense of like agitation around your very existence being questioned is extremely exhausting. And so what I can speak to from personal experience and what I hear from a lot of trans peers is just like we are exhausted, you know? And that's kind of how we're entering the space of education. Um, and I think that that can have, I mean, that has hugely, you know, hard, that presents a huge challenge for students, for trans students, because we only have so much brain space, you know? And to try to balance this, as I was saying, this constant fear, this constant feeling of being erased systematically, with also trying to fully throw ourselves into our educational pursuits, our extracurricular activities, can be a very hard balance. And so to speak to where trans students are coming from, that's definitely what I'd say is that this sense of exhaustion is really present in the way that myself and I think a lot of my trans peers are entering educational spaces.
Yeah, thank you, Luna, for starting us off with that. And thank you, everyone who's working to organize this. I just think, I mean, honestly, this is so much what we need to be doing right now, is transforming the cultures of our wherever we work and go to school by like creating spaces to support each other and articulate the norms that we want to see together. I mean, when I think about this, also I really appreciated the opening. You know, I've been involved in, you know, trans liberation work for the last 25 years. And obviously there's been a lot of ups and downs, and this is a really rough moment. But the thing that's been really consistent for trans and non-binary people is that we are like, you know, heavily marginalized. We experience extremely high rates of poverty, criminalization, deportation, and disability from exclusion from healthcare, right? So that's been true of us for as long as we've been being, you know, targeted in these ways, which is coterminous with U.S. history. And the like the I feel like there can be this like failure of an intersectional analysis a lot of times around trans and non-binary experience that is really essential right now because our trans students who are also activists in the movement to end the genocide of Palestinians, who are also immigrants facing visa laws, who are also people with you know, criminal records, who are facing the continued expansion in our city, in our county, in our state, and in our country of systems of criminalization. It's all happening at once. And so many people's pathway as trans people is that we lose family support, lose access to school, get pushed out of high schools, can't make things happen in college because of the kinds of harassment that I saw even in the questions that people submitted for this conversation, the experiences people were sharing as faculty, staff, and students at UW-Bothell. So there's a lot here that I think we'll talk about today, but I just want us to like be thinking about that in terms of how the overlapping crises that may be happening in many of our lives and many of the lives of people that we're supporting and that we love, and that Luna is describing, who are like often young people trying to go to school, stressed out, dealing with all this for the first time, seeing these executive orders that are essentially like fantasies of extermination about your own community, and then trying to like get up and go to school, you know, and like deal with your professor who is, you know, harassing you about your pronoun or whatever. It's rough, you know, it's really hard right now. And really thinking pragmatically together, which I think we're going to be doing today, about like what it means to support one another, even if laws and policies are not on our side, which honestly is the history of trans people. You know, like we've had this brief moment of mainstreaming in which a few laws and policies changed. And honestly, a lot of those weren't even implemented. You know, a lot of trans people still face the same levels of harassment and school push out. And right. So we want to be realistic about how sort of ineffective some of those things even were and how kind of starter they were, and be like, okay, but what we've always done is figure out how to support each other and try to produce culture together. And one of the things I'll say is in terms of the conditions that trans and non-binary people are facing is isolation. Like one of the worst dangers in our lives is isolation. And I think there's also just greater isolation of college students than ever before. Like there's a great, even as you all were saying about the research you did, people are less involved in extracurriculars, especially at commuter schools. A lot of people don't have enough friend support, aren't getting any support through the college, counseling program. Everywhere I go, all over the country to speak at universities and colleges, everyone is saying the counseling support is lower than what is needed for college students. Like people are in distress because of like ecological collapse and fascism. There's so many reasons. And then additionally for queer and trans students, a feeling of real direct fear and things that are happening in their classrooms and dorms. And so isolation becomes like really one of the worst dangers. And so even like just the cultural pieces we can do on campus to address that are so much more meaningful than I think people realize. And it's not just like, how can I signal that I'm a trans ally, but how can I actually produce space with others and show up to it? So that the people in the community know that folks have their backs. And so they even have someone to turn to if they're feeling particularly scared or they're in a dangerous situation. And we'll talk about this more later, I think, but I'm quite concerned about suicide for our community right now. It's a real thing that's happening. And so really thinking carefully about the kinds of social and cultural supports we can put in place to support people who are appropriately really scared right now and facing real consequences to the current upsurge of visibility of hateful messages about non-binary trans people. So yeah, things are really rough. I think it's okay to acknowledge that it doesn't mean we're giving in, but it also is important to like have some space for like the grief of that. Like it's really scary right now. We're all gathered here because we share that fear. I just want to normalize that. Also, we are gathered here. That is extremely beautiful and important. As much as I hate what's going on, I have to say, like, as somebody, who's pushing 50 and being trans in this world, it's also amazing to me. I've never seen protests this size where so many people care about like hospitals that are refusing to treat trans young people now. Like the level of support and care for us is also high, while the attack is very, very material and dangerous. So just trying to really tune into what support is here and be grateful that we're here together and that we're going to like talk about, get into the weeds about what we can be doing together.
Thank you so much, Luna and Dean. I really appreciate the way that you're speaking to the affect of being at stake and naming things like fear and grief and exhaustion. It's really important for us to be alert to those things and to what our students are bringing into our classrooms and common spaces. Thank you so much. We're going to shift a little bit to structure, which I can hear also, Dean, kind of in your figuring of these issues. So I'd like to invite in Jorge Barron. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him. Again, elected to be member of the Metropolitan King County Council in November 2023 and serving as the representative for District 4 for the council from January 2024 till December 2026. Previously, Barron served as the executive director of the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project from 2008 until 2023, and as a staff attorney with the organization from 2006 to 2008. Barron has been featured and quoted in numerous local and national publications, including the Seattle Times, the New York Times, and KUOW. Thank you so much, Jorge. So we wanted to ask you, again, because we're trying to do this intersectional work, what legal protections and supports do trans students have in the US, in Washington and King County, and at UW? So thinking through a few different scales here.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm really honored to be part of this conversation and really grateful to everybody who's participating and joining. And I just want to sort of echo the gratitude and what Dean said about that it's heartwarming to see many people coming together for these conversations and being part of these spaces. I think that's really important, particularly at moments like these. I want to sort of just first begin by just expressing that I am here as much to learn as to share. because you know, I'm now finding myself in this role after being an advocate in the immigration space for over 2 decades. Now in this role as policymaker, and I am working to try to identify ways that we can be more supportive and particularly to try to defend communities in many of the communities that are under attack right now. But of course, as a proud parent of a trans daughter, Luna, I'm particularly interested in making sure that we are doing what we can at the local level and the state level to protect trans community members. And I've been doing that through various roles that I play on the council, including serving on the Board of Health here in King County, being chair of the Law and Justice Committee, and through other work. I think the question on sort of the legal protections, which is something that I've been trying to sort of figure out, like where we at the state and local level can play a greater role, is kind of a good news and bad news situation. So I guess the good news is that, you know, we do have good legal protections in place in Washington State and at the county level, and in many cities, that you know, provide protection for example, for discrimination on the basis of gender identity, and so on issues like, you know, employment and housing and public accommodations, and to some degree on health insurance issues. But I think I want to acknowledge that I think part of the challenge that we have in any of those kind of like legal systems is that the question of sort of what the law says should be the reality, and what the reality on the ground sometimes differ, right? And I think particularly the ability of people to be able to actually make those rights effective. What tools do they have? Because, you know, going along, you know, what Luna was sharing about sort of being exhausted of having to just exist, you know, when rights are being violated, you know, how easily can you actually assert those rights and have those rights be implemented, right? So if somebody discriminates against you, like the law says that they're not allowed to do that, okay, well, that's nice, but like if you're actually being discriminated against, how are you actually going to be able to get access? So that requires, you know, having access to either the sort of the government entities that might effectuate those rights, right? Which here in Washington State and King County are things like the Human Rights Commission or the Civil Rights Program within King County. But we in the state and the county level need to make sure that there are enough resources to actually be able to handle those cases. And I want to say that, like, we, for example, at the county, have not, you know, particularly a couple of years ago, we're not at a place where we're actually had the capacity and the strength to be able to do that. So that's something that we're kind of trying to work on to make sure that people are actually able to access those things. The other thing that I want to highlight is that I think the other thing that I want to sort of always talk about when we're talking about sort of the legal protections that people have is understanding the interplay between the different levels of government. And because in some areas, for example, there might be you know, federal discrimination provisions that might be in alignment and might help protect people when it comes to certain protected classes. But of course, right now with the current federal administration, we have a completely different reality when we're talking about, you know, trans community, where it is the federal government that's actually, you know, actively discriminating against this community, while at the same time we have state laws that say kind of the exact opposite. And in some ways, those interactions and in some ways the conflict that is happening right now is one that has yet to be resolved, right? So when I tell people, well, you know, in Washington State, you have the right to not be discriminated on the basis of gender identity, that's true under state law, but that state law doesn't protect you from discrimination from the federal government, for example, right? Like we can't effectuate the state law, doesn't cover the federal government. And so if you're applying for a federal job right now, you know, there's a question as to whether those discrimination provisions are going to be enforced, even though the federal job might be here in Washington State. Similarly, when we're talking about things that again have to do with the federal government, like, you know, getting a passport, and then we could talk, and I think we're going to talk later a little bit about the intersection with, like, for immigrant students and for international students, where There may be strong protections at the state level, but when it comes to dealing with like immigration matters and when you're dealing with issues around uh, uh, travel internationally and your ability to potentially come back to the U.S. Those are issues of much greater concern, where our state and local laws are not going to have the strength to be able to protect people. So again, I say the good news, more difficult news part of it, because we want to recognize that we do have a good place for people, for trans and gender expansive people, to be here in Washington State, where there are protections. And I don't want to undermine the importance of those laws and those protections, because I think they play a significant role, and they do alter the behavior of entities here within the state of Washington, certainly within private actors that are not playing in the federal space. But I also want to sort of like acknowledge that reality sometimes, because I often, I think when those of us, I'm a lawyer, and so like a lot of us like play in this role where we're very familiar with the different jurisdictional boundaries and categories of government. But for a lot of people, that's not their common experience, right? They feel like they're in Washington, and so going to the airport may seem like, why should I be treated differently there? Or if I'm accessing a federal building, or if I'm accessing a military base, like, why should I be treated differently, even though I'm physically here in the space, the state of Washington? And so, yes, we have strong legal protections here that are important, but again, we're working hard, and I think we need to do a lot of work to make sure that those protections, to the extent that they do apply, not at the federal level, that they're strengthened, that the tools and the abilities and people's access to legal assistance when those rights are being violated. That's something that we can continue to do more at the local level. And I don't want to get into too much detail here, but there's a lot of other work that's been done to protect people. For example, with the state's SHIELD law, to protect access to both reproductive health care and gender affirming care here. And so I'm happy to sort of share and put on the chat some of the resources so that people can get into more details, and I'm happy to sort of tackle specific questions. But I think the other thing that I would say, just to close, is that I'm concerned that the thing that is already happening is sort of the attacks on the federal government using its power, and particularly the power of the money that it has, to try to undermine some of these protections by forcing us to have to choose in some ways, and we've seen that already with threats to gender affirming care, by threatening to deprive entities that provide care for young people, from getting money taken away, and that's a significant threat, and something that, again, I think I'm grateful that our state attorney general and others are fighting against. But that makes it, a particularly challenging time, because we're not sure how all of these legal cases are going to end up playing out in the long term. So happy to talk in more detail, but that's a quick overview of how we're seeing it at the state and local level.
Can I add one thing to this?
Yeah,
before
I
we
was
go?
just gonna actually invite you in.
Yeah, just I think I have a more pessimistic view about laws and policies, and I just want to share it. What I spent my life saying about trans law and politics is that I don't think anti-discrimination laws or hate crime laws or training the police or any of the stuff we've been told will help actually works. And I think we can see that from a long history of like racism, ableism, sexism have all been illegal in the United States for more than half a century. And the on the ground conditions have worsened during that period for all the groups that are supposedly protected, right? Like we've seen like a widening gendered wealth gap, racial wealth gap. We've seen a drastic increase of the criminalization and immigration enforcement systems that Jorge and others have worked so hard against for your whole entire career, which I'm so grateful for. But as for me, coming of age as a trans person in the like late 90s, early 2000s, and looking around at how at the time the gay and lesbian rights movement was like, really using a very like inaccurate story about the civil rights movement to say like that now let's have gays, lesbians go get those same rights, and as if that thing had resolved racism in the US. And I think so I came of age in this period and was like, that's a lie about how racism has worked in the United States. The anti-discrimination legal regime doesn't work. It was designed as a cover for an ongoing, like persistent set of conditions that produce marginalization for the same communities. And what I've been saying and wrote my first book about was how like trans people shouldn't be like, we should be next, because actually it doesn't work. So, you know, we've had jurisdictions now for 2 decades that have had some level of protection against gender identity and expression discrimination, and including Washington State. And my experience here has been that it is like unreal how much overt discrimination. I mean, I remember I first moved here, somebody reached out to me who was like, had been assigned as an alternative to prison to a drug treatment facility. And the drug treatment facility wouldn't take them because they were trans. And then they were like, no, I don't have to go to prison. And I was like, well, this is a state that has a law against discrimination again on the basis of gender identity. I'm going to call the Attorney General's office. I'm going to call these places and try to get help for you. And they were all just like, no, too bad, whatever. And that has been my experience of representing trans people in this period. So not to say that there aren't good intentions like behind people trying to make those laws. And I think Jorge is right that to some degree, some potential discriminators like get a signal from it. But we've never been able to count on that stuff. And that's terrible. On the other hand, the good news is things are as they've always been. It's on us. We actually have to protect and care for each other. We actually have to change norms. That's why it was so important that we spent so much time trying to get gender neutral bathrooms and universities and colleges and libraries, and trying to like get those kind of more on the ground down here policies. Like, can a student change their name on their ID, even if they don't have a legal name change? Can the roster not say their old name so they don't have to have that experience in the classroom? It's really that work that everyone in this room can do. And for me, that matters because in our culture, we're very disempowered. We're like told to wait for like elected officials and judges and stuff to take in legislatures to take care of it. And like, it's not looking good, you know? And so, and yes, we should, everything we do pressures them. And, you know, sometimes some of them do something good, but like really the amazing thing is that it's like at the level of the practices that are in our immediate surroundings, whether the law is on our side or not, whether the policy at the school is on our side or not. We can, I mean, what we used to do is we used to change the signs on the bathrooms over and over again at our colleges and universities and not get caught. That's what we used to do. You know what I mean? Like, that's the level that we are at again right now. And many people stayed at that level. Many schools never adopted any of these policies, and some of them did unevenly. I'm sure at Bothell it sounds like it's pretty uneven. And so I just, you know, I want to like, I really appreciate the update from Jorge, but I also just want to remind us that like, there's such a limit to those laws and policies, and we don't like, they don't work, and we don't actually need to wait for them. You know, like this is really on us. And I think it's hard. There are some really, like, you know, I spent years trying to get Medicaid rules to allow trans people to have trans healthcare, even in places where it's supposed to. It still doesn't give trans people the healthcare that, and now it's really scary. Federal government's like, no, Medicaid will not cover trans healthcare, and people will die because of that, no doubt. People are already dying because of the cuts they're already doing to the Medicaid infrastructure, right? So we have to like be aware of the painful structural pieces that are coming down from on high. But when it feels like we can't do anything about them because they're so far away, we got to be like, well, how do we get hormones to people in our own community? People are doing that, you know, like this kind of like bottom up is kind of the only thing we have, you know?
I just wanna, can I chime in just to give an example that one of the students talked about that was important to them, which I think relates to what we're talking about.
Yeah, please,
Um,
Shane.
So, you know, like a lot of the students complained, well, they were excited about the gender neutral bathroom in the new building, the innovation building, but they complained about, you know, like our 2 main buildings don't have gender neutral bathrooms. And so like part of the cultural shift, one student talked about in terms of an affirming act that a faculty member did, was they just said, yes, we know that this building doesn't have gender neutral bathrooms, and I'm gonna extend the break, you know, so anybody can go and take the time and come back. So I think that's an example of just acknowledging like the reality of the situation and shifting, you know, shifting for your whole class to be able to do something that is really important, and make the classroom space more comfortable for everyone. So I think that would be an example that we thought was like really important from the student responses.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate that we're able to speak like in terms of federal policy and the way that it drills down into our local systems, and then think about what resistance and care can look like on a person-to-person basis. Let's kind of steer into that zone with Luna. And our next question I loved that we heard earlier about kind of the limits of like self-identifying as an ally, but what actually is one doing uh, in terms of allyship. So the question is for Luna and then others, if they want to come in a little bit later, what role can allies play for trans students? What are practical things they can do to show support and maybe also maybe beyond support?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And thank you for all the perspectives. And I just kind of want to echo what has been being said about, this questioning of like what allyship actually looks like and what jumping into action for trans individuals in your community actually looks like. And so I kind of want to focus with this question on some of the practical things that I've noticed can be really beneficial around creating space that welcomes and celebrates trans identity. Um, it just on a classroom level, in a small community level. And one of these things is actually kind of coming from my experience and from the experience I've heard from a lot of my trans peers, is the importance of language. And I know we kind of hear this a lot in these conversations when we're talking about proper use of pronouns, someone's preferred pronouns, proper use of someone's preferred name. Those elements are extremely vital, but are very baseline, you know? Um, that's kind of the bare minimum when I think about what allyship looks like in a classroom level, because allyship is really about going above and beyond to create welcoming, loving space for trans individuals, when we're talking about allyship for trans folks specifically. And so when I talk about the importance of language, I mean that in every aspect of curriculum, how you address students, how you interact in the classroom or, over online communication with students and with other faculty, um, should be specifically mindful and actively engaging and welcoming and inclusive of trans individuals and trans experience. And I know that that might be kind of hard to contextualize. And so a way in which I like to contextualize it kind of from my own experience here at the University of Washington, Seattle, is that an area I think that is a real struggle area for myself and for some other trans individuals, trans students I know, is this feeling of exclusion from science curriculums, specifically when we are talking about biology. Um, I know myself, I'm currently in this really interesting bioanthropology course, but I think something that I've noticed and actually been able to have some dialogue with my professor in that course around is that there are some very subtle ways in which language and the way that language is used can even unintentionally become trans exclusive, especially when we're talking about when we're referring to you know areas of science that are commonly which materials is commonly weaponized, misconstrued and weaponized against trans individuals and trans existence. It is very easy to slip into a, dialogue that inherently excludes trans students. And so the importance of specificity in making sure that the way you're addressing like important intellectual topics is creating space for trans students to actively engage with those topics in a way that's meaningful, just like any other student. As I was kind of saying beforehand, like this baseline idea for trans students is we want to be welcomed into a space just like any other student, we want to have this equal and equitable access to uh, dive really deeply into our intellectual pursuits. And when language is trans exclusive, even in like the smallest ways, that can prove like a really big blockage for trans individuals to feel like they can be welcome to join in these intellectual pursuits, especially because as I was saying earlier, we only have so much brain space. And so when our brain space has to be dedicated to, oh, should I talk to my professor about how that actually, the way they talked about like X topic, they used some language that I felt was exclusive, then we're getting pulled away from what we should be able to be in class for. And so as a faculty member, or as staff, or even as like a peer of students, to be really mindful that you're creating through your language and through the ways you address topics, specifically topics that are commonly weaponized against trans individuals, to make sure you're using language that is welcoming of trans individuals is hugely important. And I think also when I think about allyship and what active allyship can look like, a lot of the time, you know, trans individuals are kind of, we're kind of given this burden to share our own stories and narratives, and to fight for the centering of our narratives, and also to provide like educational labor to our peers, and to even to like those in positions of power above us, like faculty or deans or so on and so forth, if we're thinking in the realm of higher education. And so I think something that's really vital also is to make sure if you're an ally, if you are self-identifying as an ally to trans people, it's really important that you are doing the labor of centering trans narratives in, everything you do. And that you are not passing the burden of education onto your trans peers or your trans students, because although it is extremely wonderful and vital for trans individuals to be able to share their stories and feel safe in doing that, it is really important that that is not the expectation. And so those two pieces of specificity around language, so that we're actively creating spaces that are welcoming and inclusive to trans individuals, and also that piece around doing the labor yourself of centering trans narratives, rather than having that be an expectation of your trans students or peers, are two hugely important practical pieces for allyship, I think, in the higher educational space.
Thank you, Luna. That was so exquisitely generous and precise. I really appreciate what you're saying about creating welcoming and loving space that produces this like effectively and in terms of curriculum, but then also through language, and not placing the labor on trans students to testify, to teach. That is so crucial. And I appreciate your underscoring it here. I also love that the welcome that you are like asking for is also intellectual, right? And what you had to say about your experience in a biology classroom is really pointed. I know that there's some resources in the chat, and we're going to be collating those and like making them available to folks later, that talks about how to teach biology and gender inclusive ways. Thank you so, so much. I think we can shift now. I'm going to kind of expand the question that we have coming, or at least kind of frame it in a kind of two-part way. So the first part is about policy, which has been a thread this morning. Are there places where we should push our institution towards policies that are more inclusive of transgender students? Where do we need more work? For instance, allyship training, creating a website outlining campus policies related to gender identity. And then I think if I can, I know there was a question articulated in the chat that maybe we can attach as a way of doing the kind of mutual holding that I heard Dean doing before, which is to say that, policy is not enough. How do we create conditions for the kinds of on-the-ground practices of care and intervention and self-resourcing that are needed when policy fails. Is that all right? So to think about like what policy can do and then what policy can't do and how we can support those movements and actions. And here, again, I'm inviting in Dean as well as Chingy and Neil and their research, but you all are very welcome to speak to this.
Y'all want to start?
Was that too big?
No, yeah, it's great.
Okay,
Want to start it off?
cool. Yes.
I can hop in with that. So I've been thinking a lot as we've been talking, and I kind of want to answer this question and pull a few threads together. I think one thing around policy that's kind of interesting. I think one of the things that really stuck out, that's really important to take away from the work that we have been doing, is that the classroom is the space that really matters at Bothell. Like, as things are right now, that's where students are meeting other students. That's where students are finding mentors among their faculty. That's where students are trying out their identity. That's where they're learning how to be trans in many ways. Like some students talked about, for instance, like going into the room, the classroom, and like figuring out who to sit next to, like through the vibe. So that's sort of these social practices that like students are experiencing. We don't have a large campus culture outside of the classroom space. And so I would say that that's really where we need to focus on thinking through supporting trans students at this current moment. So some ways that I see that, and then I'll see what you think too, Chingy. Like, first off, like some big structural things, like I would really love for us to think about our curriculum as a campus and not just within our individual schools. I think that the way we're structured, especially around budgeting, has us compete with one another and not like ever collaborate or see how we can work across like our different curricular structures. So that would be one thing. Like, how do we see also that students are like getting social needs met in classes in certain schools and then getting no experience or conversation about trans stuff when they enter their upper division in their major. Like it's kind of similar to, because I'm a writing person, it's like kind of similar to how I think about writing. Like if you only get writing in your first year and then suddenly you don't have it anymore till you're a senior and you have to write a capstone, it's going to make it really hard to like grow as a writer. And so similarly, like these kinds of conversations are with thinking about content, but also representation, like that's really important. I would say that, that maybe should be something we look at when we assess our diversity classes. Like I don't know what the criteria is for that specific designation because I was on a different assessment committee, but I know, and Raisa was on that committee with that same one with me. Like there are ways that we can kind of really think about that, representation across the whole curriculum. I would say too, to speak to like what folks are talking about with this, with STEM curriculum, I think that this came up among a lot of our STEM majors, just that they did not have any like conversations about identity at all. Like once they got into their majors, like there wasn't like a historical or social grounding in the science that they were learning. And a lot of them felt, some of them expressed like, that made it really hard to kind of know why you were doing what you were doing and like feel an investment in your own learning. You were just like learning facts to know how to, make combustion engines work, for example. Like that's not a problem, but like it is important, for folks to have the opportunity to like do that kind of work across like different types of classes. I'd say another big thing would be we're a campus that's we've had this like startup culture for so long, and we're like kind of finally getting to a point where like people are being told no about stuff a lot more. And I feel like as we continue, especially with like new really big projects like new buildings, I would like us to really think about how can we bring students into those conversations, especially students who have very small populations on campus, but are really, really impacted by the choices that are made around what we're doing. For example, our campus has decided not to have a student health center location here. I got the report as to why. That is going to be a real problem for trans students who are trying to seek trans healthcare in a healthcare environment and climate where, it's very difficult to access any kind of trans related healthcare through your insurance. And so that's one particular example of that, but we could think about that for any of the like big major sort of structural things that are shifting and kind of concretizing at this moment at UW. And I'll touch last on like the idea of like ally training. One thing that like when we talked about this with the ODEI fellows, one thing we learned amongst that small group was that everyone had the people who had attended some kind of training that talked about trans experience, like had all done that very voluntarily. And there weren't very many people who had done that. And it's just not something that's like built into the culture here at UW at the current moment. And it is important to have these kinds of like ongoing, like base level conversations about what it means to be trans. And that sort of work shouldn't always be done by trans people who are trying to make this campus livable for them and their students. You want to add anything?
I will say I just want to touch on conversations that have come up around isolation and mental health. One of the things the students have mentioned is there was a wide variance in terms of how students felt connected. I think students who had like a campus job felt like they, knew what was going on or knew of things that were happening. But if you didn't have something like that, it's very hard students had to be very self-reliant and kind of self-organized to build connections. And I think there's a communication issue on our campus. Students have a hard time finding out about events where, like even if there is like a trans space at the diversity center, they don't know when things are happening. And I did ask them, like, how do you find out about things going on campus? So like, we look at the wall, that there seems like there must be a better way, so if someone's looking for support to find out how to get support. So yeah, I think that's what it is.
Yeah. And I think to build off that too, we're in this moment where we're trying to like not have things be public. Like almost all the like information for the diversity center is on SharePoint right now instead of like a website for the diversity center. And that makes sense. This isn't a criticism of that choice, but it does make it harder for students to find anything that's going on campus. So, as we kind of move through this moment where we feel very anxious about putting anything into an email or a public post, that's going to also be an impact. We need to be persistent with our other ways of communicating and reaching out a lot.
Maybe I'll add to that a few things about some of the things I've seen over the years on campuses that have been useful. I mentioned a little bit like, there's kind of levels of like campus policy. Like I love, Neil, that you're talking about like they're building new buildings, like make there be gender neutral bathrooms. The Seattle airport has a lot of gender neutral bathrooms. It's not a big deal. Everyone can use it, just like whatever. Like, I think there's plenty of really great arguments out there that can be brought, but like having kind of an organized campaign around that where like faculty and staff really hold that down since students come and go, like really have a structured, I mean, in a way, I recommend having like a trans agenda for UW Bothell and being like, we are working all of these relentlessly and doing it in a number of ways. But so bathrooms is one piece, making sure people can change their ID and their records, that graduates can get a transcript that says their current name, that doesn't out them, especially as we move towards greater criminalization of trans people. I think we're moving towards a period where it may become that people experience like fraud charges for being trans. So like people really are going to be able to need to be able to get transcripts that say whatever they currently go by, like just getting those policies. And that may come all the way at the state level since it's a public school. I don't entirely know how the University of Washington works, and Jorge and others may know more about that, but it's it's different than working in a private school and just trying to work with that one administration. That stuff seems like something that the whole UW community across all the different campuses could be working on together, or possibly even a broader set of Washington public schools. It has been huge at so many schools to make sure there is that whatever, I don't know where students who, since there's not a health center there, if they go to other student health centers like at UW Saddle or somewhere else, but like making sure those health centers have hormones and have trans competent counselors. I mean, that is so common that they don't have a single person who's not like, giving people like truly problematic advice. I have found at Seattle U, when I wanted changes in the law school, and we started to have trans students here still very rarely in the late like around 2008, 2009. My colleagues did not know what that was. And then when we started to have a lot more trans and non-binary students who used they pronouns, my colleagues like did not know how to do it. It's a very conservative type of education, legal education. And I got a lot of like stuffy old people who like think all the students are snowflakes or whatever their story is. And so I got permission to do, like, at the beginning of every semester's faculty meeting, I went through some of the stuff I put in the chat, like, this is what a pronoun is. A lot of people in the school are using they, them. You are creating a hostile environment if you don't do this. Like, actually having faculty hear it at a faculty meeting or other mandatory spaces instead of just voluntary trainings. Voluntary trainings are good too, because you can go deeper, and people who really become allies, like, we want to like build our community, but we also want some stuff that they feel is a little more top down. And you don't want them to hear it for the first time from the student, right? Like, ideally, even if they just heard it from me and they already like think I'm weird or whatever, it's better than them hearing it for the first time from the student. And then I think additionally, a lot of the questions that came in were people telling some stories about bad things happening in the classroom. So who do you report? I don't know who that is at Bothell. Here at the Seattle U Law School, if a student had a bad experience, I'd tell them to go to our academic dean. And that academic dean would call on the faculty member and be like, hey, we're hearing that you're doing this thing in class. And so we want that person. That's a really important person. Whoever it is who tells faculty to stop doing stuff, like, that person that needs to become our ally. They need to be highly competent if possible, so that when students complain, they don't reach a dead end. And they actually, and so that faculty members get feedback, not just from students who they often dismiss because of, ageism and power dynamics, but also from like whatever is essentially their boss. So that's been huge for me, is to always try to create a deep relationship with whoever could actually tell faculty this is not okay, when that's possible. Sometimes that person is not open to it. One more piece on this. And I mean, honestly, when I did this stuff, I always would like go in there with a bunch of bluster about how they had to do this. And I would find things in the faculty code and in the law to say they had to do it and show how normal it was and show everywhere that it's happening. Look, it's happening at the SeaTac airport. Look, it's happening. You just find that evidence, even though of course we know there's just as many places where it's not happening, but you just are like, this is the deal. This is the official deal. Don't get yourself in trouble. Like, that mode, I think, sometimes works on resistance faculty members, but some people are just never going to do it. So the other piece is, how do we create a robust culture so when students have bad experiences, in the same way that there's just like on every campus, there's like racist faculty members, there's like sexist, like, and the school won't get rid of them. Like, when students have bad experiences, that there's a big caring community, people who are like, yeah, that sucks. That's not right that happened to you. Because things are really only traumatic if they happen to you in total isolation and no one cares for you afterwards, right? Like, so much worse. But if you get support and know it wasn't you, it was them, it can really make a difference. The other thing I'll say is, I know there's a lot of work happening throughout the UW campuses about how to support students who are losing their visas. And one of the questions is, can we provide free legal support to students who are facing those conditions? And we can think about that more generally. So a lot of trans students lose housing because of being trans. A lot of students may be facing losing healthcare or not getting the healthcare they need. Can we push the university to provide it? And can we also create mutual aid projects where we provide it? So can we, create that, but also be like, now university, you fund this, you know what I mean? Like, what's the balance there? And especially like, for a lot of trans students, housing is really like one of those main things. Like, if their parents find out they're trans and they lose their housing that way, or like, if they have to leave a dangerous relationship, these are like very common experiences. But I think there's a question in there about how much we can push our universities to provide for immediate, urgent needs for students in crisis. And is there anything to do that with already? Can it be expanded? Like, some schools have some little pockets of that. Some schools don't have anything. Like, some schools have support for students who are from foster care to not have to leave the dorms during Christmas break. Like, you know what I mean? It's really varies, right? But so trying to find things like that are similar and be like, okay, you do this. Guess what? There's another pocket of students who need that now. And it's an uphill battle, but I think it's like having really, really high expectations and fighting for those. And then of course, sometimes you squeeze some concessions out of them about the things that are cheaper along the way, you know, and you keep going, you keep going. But I think having a really clear agenda like that, it's like, we don't want people just to be like, we all need to be nice to trans people. That's not enough. Like the things, you know what I mean? Getting clear about what that agenda really looks like.
Thank you so much. Luna, you've just posted in the chat, but maybe you want to speak about this.
Yeah, sure. So when I think thinking a lot about these conversations around resources, I'm hearing a lot about how the UW Bothell campus is kind of lacking in that area of not having the, if correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing is like not having the health center for students, not having an LGBTQ resource center. So I did want to just plug in that I am a the student program specialist at the UW Center, which is our LGBTQ resource center, and we do run resources and services out of the Seattle campus, but those are open to students, staff, and faculty from all campuses. So if students come to you as faculty or as staff specifically looking for uh, uh, services or resources regarding LGBTQ issues and topics in the UW systems, you can feel free to point them to our website. Yeah, we have a really great diversity of services from, you know, game nights, discussion groups, yeah, the mentorship program, and this gender affirming item distribution program, which I oversee. So yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions regarding that, but that's just a really great resource that students from all campuses and staff from all campuses can be plugged into.
Thank you so much, Luna. I think we're really kind of in the tension around what maybe can be like caring and advantageous about being on a small campus. Like I appreciated Neil and Chingy how you're naming that students really value small class size and the intimacy they can experience here. And then also the ways in which we're cut off from centralized resources. So that's great to know, Luna, about the Q Center. Someone should correct me if I'm wrong. The last time I checked about our students being able to access like healthcare services, for example, on the main campus, I was told that they could not. So I don't know if there's been a policy shift around that, but that is a really a severe limitation given that we have no in-house resources related to student health and trans health. Transit is also a big issue for our students. Like simply getting to the U District is not viable for many of them. Many of our students work full-time and they don't have the hours in the day. So I appreciate like naming all of these actions we can do and pursue. And I love, Dean, that you're saying like sometimes it's time for top down. Like we have high expectations and we're going to see what we can get out of this. And then there are also real ways that we're constrained. So thinking about those mutual aid strategies is really important. Thank you so much. We're going to shift a little bit here, but continuing to pull threads that have already been named. So as we're thinking intersectionally, how do we advise undocumented or international or green card holding trans students who may face discrimination or fear of disclosure upon returning home, either voluntarily or through deportation? And so we're going to throw this to you, Jorge.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very tough question and a very heavy question because I think, you know, as we talked about earlier, you know, this is a space, the immigration issues are obviously very much heavily controlled by the federal government. And we have a federal administration that, as somebody pointed in the chat, just doesn't recognize trans people as an identity, as their existence is not recognized by the federal government, and so it is a very you know, it's difficult for trans community members generally, but I think for folks who are in a you know, undocumented status or in a temporary status right now, it is, you know, those communities are under attack as well. So we have this like confluence of like two identities that make the situation particularly difficult for folks. So I guess the first thing I would say is, you know, to the point that was raised earlier about legal resources. You know, whenever sort of people ask me, I always try to encourage people to the extent that they're able to have an individualized, you know, consultation with an immigration attorney, an immigration practitioner to understand what their situation is individually, and especially if folks are actually considering, you know, to part of the question, like if they're probably voluntarily return to their home country and travel, and perhaps it's just a temporary visit, they're visiting family. But in the current circumstances, I think people need to really like understand what their situation is and what consequences may come from that. Certainly for folks who are undocumented, the situation at the border is very difficult. And the consequences of actually leaving the country can be very significant in terms of their ability to pursue things. I actually, you know, when I worked in my previous work, I said, you know, in this moment, even getting close physically to the border is as at risk. I mean, I've seen people who have actually, you know, been trying to like, you know, not even leave the country, but happen to literally take the wrong exit on I-5, you know, going north, and they forgot to exit on time and ended up at the Canadian border by accident, and that triggered them being, you know, detained. And so it's a sad statement that we have to sort of like warn people to not even, you know, to limit their travel within the physical United States. But unfortunately, particularly for like undocumented students and even for folks with temporary status, I think they have to be very careful about that because it does increase the risk. You know, generally, you know, obviously, like I do want people to, you know, make sure that they are aware of, you know your rights, resources, and the ability for them to exercise their constitutional rights. I always tell people that doesn't mean that they're going to be necessarily protected from detention or deportation because, you know, as I think, you know, everybody's seeing in the news, the current administration, and I will say even under prior administrations, immigration agencies have just this like culture and ethos of violating rights, and to the point that we were talking about earlier of like how do we actually exercise those rights and implement those rights in a context, in a deportation context where you're not entitled to you know, kind of a public defender, an immigration lawyer in your immigration process, and where we're seeing, you know, the current administration, uh, even the very limited due process that has been traditionally provided to people or generally provided to people, they're even taking that away, right? By explicitly saying that they can use, you know, wartime authorities to be able to deport people. I don't even like to use the word that they're deporting people because deporting suggests a process, and at this point they're really, you know, renditioning people out of the United States without any even a modicum of process at this point. So it is a heavy time. I do want to note that, you know, when I tell people, you know, try to get a consultation. So I appreciate that there is this process through for either students to have this legal consultation, which can be informative, and I think it's something that I would encourage people to take advantage of to understand their own individual situations, because like very specific circumstances about each individual's case is important. Um, uh, the other thing that I'm like trying to sort of like, you know, and again, this is something that I don't like to sort of like emphasize because I think it's hard to tell people that they need to be kind of not able to express themselves, but being hyper aware that you know, right now the administration and the Department of Homeland Security is really screening social media for people who are non-citizens, and so that they're going to be using whatever information is out there publicly through social media channels against you when you're traveling. And so just to be mindful of that. And then for folks who are traveling, who maybe have valid status and have a valid visa and feel like they have at least comfort of traveling, I do encourage also for folks to be thinking about a plan, right? And so, for example, making sure that somebody, like if they're traveling back to the U.S., that they know that somebody knows like their travel plans, who's aware and paying attention, and they contact people, because if somebody does get detained so sometimes like there's like secondary screening that happens, and there's going to be some additional inspection, but the person will ultimately get through. And so be prepared for some delays. But if like the person doesn't gets detained at that point, frequently they're not actually immediately able to contact somebody. And so it's important that somebody's monitoring what's happening, because otherwise it could be a long time before they're able to access information or be able to like contact an attorney. And so it's important for people to be kind of proactive and be prepared. And again, sometimes like I worry about sort of scaring people, but I think we also have to be responsible and share the realities right now are very difficult, because as Dean alluded to, the administration is now claiming that people living their identity is actually kind of a fraudulent situation, right? And so and in the immigration context, they can use those those provisions in a way that can go much, that they have much more authority in the immigration context than in other contexts that would apply to U.S. citizens. So I do think it's important for people to take resources. I'm obviously grateful that we have good organizations locally, nonprofits, both my former organization, Northwest Human Rights Project, but a lot of other organizations have focused. There's a local organization, Entre Hermanos, that works specifically with LGBTQ community members, particularly from Latin America. So there's good resources, but I can also tell you that they are extremely overwhelmed right now. And so their ability to work, especially like before people are already in kind of a crisis of detention or something like that, is fairly limited. And I think the final thing that I will say is that there's still also like these questions about how this is all going to play out, because we've had in the immigration context some ability for people to raise claims, for example, for asylum, because of gender identity, but we're not clear on how some of those previous norms are going to play out under this administration. We know that they're obviously going to try to attack them and try to get those things overturned. Some of these things we'll have to see how they play out in the courts. Obviously, I think people should be able to like try to pursue and defend themselves in their cases. But the reality of how likely it is that people are going to get protection through our immigration system is still in some areas unclear at this point. So that's what I have to share. I think one thing that I do, when folks sometimes say like, well, what about this individual right here who has a particular situation? To Dean's point, like obviously those folks can access some of the free legal resources, but I think to the extent that there's kind of mutual efforts to actually help somebody get an attorney in some of these cases, like that is something that is very proactive and helpful, so that person has legal representation, because that makes the immigration system is tough sometimes to say, that person may get an attorney and still not be able to succeed in their case, but the possibility they might succeed will certainly be much higher if they have legal representation through that process.
Thank you so much, Jorge. The conditions and the level of risk you're describing are chilling. And yet, I think we all agree that knowledge sharing is a care practice that's really essential right now. Thank you. We're going to
I have one thing to this.
please.
I just was thinking too, I mean, I know this is something people are probably thinking about, but the colleges and universities have had a pretty intense practice of recruiting international students in recent years because they pay more tuition. And now a lot of them are not backing up those students when they're facing these visa issues. And a lot of the students who are facing those issues are people who've been active and vocal about their politics. And so there's something just so unethical about like recruiting these students and then to a very hostile country telling them they're going to have this certain kind of experience and then like not backing them up. And a lot of schools are even telling them to go when actually they could stay. And, you know, there's just a lot of like, they're giving them bad advice often. I know there's a lot of people doing work on this in the UW system. But I want us to have a really high bar. Like, not only should our schools do everything they can to support those students if they're facing that, they should also, if those students for any reason get deported or leave, they should create an online option for them to finish their degree. Like it is, they brought them here, they took their money, and there's something so extractive and just like inappropriate about the ways that I think those international students have been recruited and treated on our campuses, and a lot of them not given the support even to thrive in the educational settings that they've been brought to. So I wonder how we can all show a lot of solidarity as many of them are facing exactly what Jorge is describing. And sometimes sometimes it's hard for us to figure out what to do about that besides try to get them lawyers, but we can definitely push our universities to be more ethical.
Thank you so much. That is urgent, and it reminds me of so much of the storytelling I've heard from international students on this campus has been about the experience of loneliness and isolation. So really entwined with what we've been thinking about for trans and gender expansive students. And sometimes, of course, it is the same student. Okay, this question, Dean, is addressed to you with everyone else invited. How do we respond to students who advocate for anti-trans ideology under the guise of freedom of speech? Especially, and this was a question that was contributed by someone attending today, when I have LGBTQ plus students in class, how do I operate when the classroom is collaborative, discussion-based, and team project focused?
This is a great question. I mean, and I think it relates to other problems people may have. Like I've had students in my classes who advocated for colonialism, who were racist to other students in the room, you know, like just everything, you know, just we have teaching is hard and we have these students who have all kinds of views coming into this space. And I think the thing that professors do that's the worst is try to ignore it. You know, like that really leaves the vulnerable students who are experiencing the harm of that out to dry. You know, like so one thing I've really tried to push my colleagues here at Seattle U away from is being like, the really horrible thing was just said, I'm moving on. Like that's something we shouldn't do. Like we cannot stop people from saying things in our classes. And actually people say things in the world. And actually that's not the problem. The problem is what you do next. So if we still signal, it's true, our students can say whatever they want in our classrooms and like actually don't want to try to use like a carceral approach to that. I instead want to use a cultural approach of like, in this classroom, these are the things we value. And I do that in a number of ways. The beginning of the class is always creating kind of group agreements, like let's call everybody by what they go by. Let's make sure we pronounce people's names correctly and say the right pronouns, like just really establishing like multiple levels of just naming things that happen that suck all the time in classrooms, like people's names being mispronounced, people's pronouns being misused, you know, like putting multiple things on that front, not just pronouns, but like all the range of things we can think of. If we don't know someone's name, let's remember to ask again. Let's do a go around where we all say how we say our names. And if there's any tricks that people should hear who mispronounce it a lot, tell us. Like just like really encouraging people to be like, yeah, this is going to be a space where I can raise my expectations about how I'll be treated a little bit beyond a typical, you know, US classroom or whatever. And also it's okay to share that with each other. I do the like, oops and ouch thing where like if something happens that you don't like in class, say ouch. And then we can all work on it. You don't have to be the one to explain it if you don't feel like being the educator, but we all can be like, huh, I wonder why someone said ouch. Oh, someone used this term. That term, some communities doesn't feel good. Like, why? What's the history of that? Like, we figure it out as a class. And then whoever said it just says oops, because everyone makes mistakes. And so I just introduced the idea like it's okay to learn in public, you know, just all of that stuff that I think can just kind of ease people a little bit. Like, yeah, we're all here to learn, and including me. And as the teacher, I don't know everything that you guys know. I can't wait to learn from you. Like, I'm gonna make mistakes. I want you to tell me when I make them. Like, just establishing some of those norms to me at the beginning of the classroom can put some people at their ease, and it can make some of those students who are coming in here like, you know, they've got a story about me or about the class title or about other students. Sometimes they don't act out as intensely once there's an idea that like everyone's allowed to say whatever and they're not going to get in trouble if they make them, you know what I mean? But we are going to talk about it. And then the other thing is just like actually talking about it, like being like, wow, this, and sometimes if I miss one or a student tells me later that there was actually a sub meeting meaning that I didn't understand what was going on between two students, then the next day I'm like, so yesterday we had a thing happen. It made me think about all this. And like, I just am like, I'm the facilitator. I have to take responsibility for this. I don't get to dip out. And that's hard. Of course, it's like, we're all just people and I'm nervous. Am I going to do it wrong? And, all, like, is this student going to complain about me? But ultimately, if you're the facilitator, you do have a positional power that we have to use. And I just like, if something happens, I don't know what to do. I ask other people. Many people in this room know my friend Angelica at UW Seattle. I call Angelica whenever I have a teaching problem. She calls me when she has a teaching problem. Our friend Chundan, Jed, who's here. These are people who I'm like, oh, these people, they've seen it before. Because sometimes one comes into my classroom, I'm like, oh, I've never had this problem before. But just being like, it's okay that I'm a learner as a teacher, not being hard on myself when I make that mistake. I had a colleague recently who worked really, really hard on a really beautiful exam that had a trans fact pattern in it. And she really wanted to not trigger students, but she also wanted to actually do some political education around some of what's happening with criminalization of trans people. And a student was really upset about it and was like, this exam, you shouldn't have done this in the exam. It was activating for me. The student wasn't trans, but has a lot of trans friends. And she gave a really thoughtful response to that student. The student had a really thoughtful response. So the other thing is like, when we do stuff that we think is supportive for trans and gender non-binary students or students of color or immigrant students or whatever, it doesn't mean every one of them will like it. And that doesn't mean we did the wrong thing. Like, and I posted something earlier about pronoun go-rounds. Sometimes people are like, I felt pressured to give a pronoun. I've decided as a teacher that even though some people don't like choosing a pronoun in class, because maybe they're in the middle of deciding, overall, it's better for all students, I find, and for me, if people don't just guess others' pronouns. That's really bad for us. So sometimes you just make a call and it's okay that not every student likes it, including students who are in those groups. You listen to it. Maybe there is, so you got to then, then that colleague came to me. She was like, what do you think, Dean? Did I do something wrong? And I was like, no, I think your exam is actually not doing that. This is how I'd respond to the student. Like, it's okay. We want to hear it. We want to be permeable to the feedback, but we also want to know we cannot please every student. But I think the fundamental thing is just really, yeah, that's Charlotte saying. But the fundamental thing is just like, I will respond to this stuff. I won't ignore that it's happening. And I might do things like remind people of the mission of my college, or like remind people of some of the statements the school has made about this, or remind people if I'm in a class with a particular like topic, I'll be like, there's a whole genealogy of wisdom about this. We're going to be studying it in these weeks. Like I might like give people, I'm not just policing you about what you're saying. I'm actually like part of something, and this is why we get these ideas, and this is why there's a whole body of things here. It's not just like you versus individual trans people. It's like this is actually an approach, and this is the approach we're using in this class. And like, like we've all taken classes where we didn't like the approach. That happens, like that. You're not the first person that happened to. I don't know. I feel like there's like a set of things to do that are all levels of hearing people, giving them space to change, letting them try things on, supporting the people who got elbowed as they went through the china shop, and also establishing a standard in the room, like I think, and then being boundary, like sticking to it, like even though it's uncomfortable to like have to deal with that moment. Anyway, I hope that's helpful.
That is so helpful, Dean. You've offered us so many beautiful practices, and I love, the acknowledgement of the tenderness of the classroom space and our responsibility as facilitators. I think that some of what you're offering can be part of what we activate in a follow-up workshop experience, if that's something that we're able to move forward with. So thank you so much. I think, the next question is really just a kind of slight kind of deepening or detour from what we've just been talking about. But we had someone name a very particular experience, and maybe we can have some conversation around this. I am regularly misgendered by my colleagues and have been misgendered by my dean in front of the entire school. It makes me super concerned about the student experience. How do we create a campus-wide culture where, when leading by example, mostly only happens in my classroom?
I'll just say if that person is here, I'm so sorry. That the exact same thing happened to me my first week at Seattle U. I was like the speaker at the big school-wide assembly, whatever thing, and the person introduced me with the wrong pronoun, and I just was like, and I'm the first trans person ever to have this job in the United States, ever to be hired as a tenured law professor or tenure track law professor, and it was awful. And I just, it's kind of like with COVID stuff, where it's like nobody's masking anymore, but I don't want people to mask in my classrooms. It's just like it's all organizing. We just have to like find our friends and organize because it's not going to come from them. You know what I mean? And so, and then I think the other thing is finding out, is there any more support here than I know? How do I really feel the support that is here when there's such a lacking support? Is there any way to build a feeling of safety by being like, oh, who came to this event? These people have my back in some way. You know, just kind of noticing it, because I think the feeling of being totally alone can sometimes be overwhelming, and it's not always true. Even if everybody's not with you 100%. You know, they're like, you know, so just trying to find who can be my partner in this bottom up thing.
Thank you. That makes me hopeful for the community that we're building here today and the ways that we can kind of externalize and make available, you know, a sense of who is here and who may continue to want to be together in these conversations. Luna, I'm gonna offer the next question to you that is about kind of identity and navigating through academic space. So again, this is someone who submitted the question speaking. I use a similar label to identify myself in various spaces. However, I have radically different experiences of that identity with my friends, family, colleagues, and students. This is more of a statement, but do the panelists have any response to the burden trans folks carry of having to guess and code switch how others will behave in view of their identities?
Yeah, thank you. And I want to thank, even if they're not here, the person who submitted this this question and this little piece of their experience, because I think that this brings up a very important um piece for educators specifically to be aware of in the ways that trans students are operating in these spaces, is that as I kind of mentioned earlier, of this feeling of exhaustion, I think that there's also this burden of hiding that is commonly, you know, is really common in trans experience. Um, this burden of having to um scope out a space that you're in to see if it's safe to exist as you are is a hugely, you know, exhausting, taxing, and harmful to your sense of self and sense of belonging experience. And this is a burden that a lot, if not all, trans folks have to experience at some point in their lives, and especially now at this time in the culture in this country that we're existing in. And even in this, even in, you know, even in this county, even in the greater Seattle area, even on all of the UW campuses, which generally pride themselves on you know, efforts to diversity and inclusion, we still, I mean, it's important to acknowledge that this ever present, as this comment brings up, burden of guessing if one is safe to be who they truly are is always going to be present. And so, I mean, this to me really brings up this point of, one, again, one, being aware that this is like an experience that students are bringing into the space, and that this is like a taxing experience. And so acknowledging that, you know, bringing that compassion and patience into the ways that you're engaging with students, specifically trans, non-binary, and gender expansive students, in that their life experiences do hugely affect the way they're coming into the classroom. As for everyone, it does, right? That's just an in general practice also, to acknowledge that life experience, you know, you never know what's going on within someone, and bringing that gentleness and compassion and patience is always just the way to go, in my opinion, and in my practice. But I think also it's important to acknowledge that this burden of code switching and trying to find spaces that feel safe is a huge injustice. You know, that this is an experience that trans folks and lots of intersectional, like this is another huge point of intersectionality, because lots of marginalized groups, people who have identities that have been marginalized, also experience these, you know, this burden of having to code switch or to guess where is safe to truly be themselves. And so I think that this brings us back to the point of, you know, when we're creating these classroom spaces, as I kind of mentioned earlier, we want to have a space that is, you know, loving and welcoming for all involved, especially in this in this baseline of trying to create a space where students can fully engage with class material, with their professors, with their peers, in a way that, you know, I'm sure as faculty, everyone wants your students to engage fully in the class. And so to understand this burden that students are coming in with is really important, but also to do your part, as I kind of mentioned earlier, in actively creating safe and loving spaces for trans students is really important in showing from the outset that this is a space where like your classroom is a space where students are free and supported and welcomed and celebrated to be themselves, is hugely vital in just creating that baseline of of welcoming space, whilst also acknowledging that despite your efforts, you know, for your classroom, that burden and that exhaustion uh and that injustice is still going to be ever present in the lives of your trans students or your students of marginalized identities in general. And that is why that baseline of like compassion and patience is really vital.
Thank you so much, Una.
Can we jump in?
Yeah, I was going to ask if you might.
Yeah. Do you want to say anything? Okay. Okay, I'll go first, I guess. I kind of want to respond to that like question also in terms of being in faculty, because I feel like that question is also somewhat related to that, and not to like to still keep it on the student experience. I think one of the things that's hardest for me as a trans faculty member is a lot of students presume a particular political or social identity with me when they recognize I'm trans. Also, it's kind of hard to grapple with if students misgender me and other students hear it, that really bothers them. And so these are things that I've experienced in every class, like at Bothell. And I think it speaks to the push and pull. Like, we're not trying to hurt each other, but these things happen, you know? And I think very similarly, students are kind of approaching this classroom space where they kind of carry a lot of the weight of like the expectation that they're going to be misgendered or that something bad is going to happen and that they have to be okay with it. This is kind of one of our participants, for example, talked about how they had not been in a classroom space at all in their time here at Bothell where they had not experienced being misgendered or the wrong name being used. And they kind of chalked it up to, they gave a lot of reasons why. They were like, well, I've largely been in classes that were, you know, had a lot of students. And, you know, these were like general education classes with a lot, you know, and it was just kind of, you know, I don't know what the right word is, but that's not good. Like that a student is sort of, you know, being both resilient about like trying to think through like, why is this happening and giving grace in that moment, but also there isn't a higher expectation of their faculty. So I think that's, yeah, just something I would add on to that. And I will say too, like, kind of going back to the question about, you know, serving or how do you respond when students like make a free speech argument. I feel like at Bothell, like actually where that happens the most, where there's the most kind of like conflict is actually around religion, because we have a very religious student population. It's far more religious than anywhere I have taught. There's students practice a wide range of religions. It's not even probably predominantly Christian, but folks come in with a very specific faith practice. And that's actually where, yeah, I've had the most kind of tense conversations around transness. especially in GWSS classrooms. And largely my response to that, I kind of fall back on like, I grew up super religious. And so like, I understand like how a faith practice structures like gender and sexuality. And so our goal in that case is for that student to be able to actually understand and grasp like what is gender and sexuality in that social sphere that you're in, and to understand you don't have to agree with all of that. And to actually kind of break that down and kind of turning the question back onto where is that assumption coming from? Like, what is the actual like rhetoric or structure or sacred text in like say about XYZ, and not just what your community says about XYZ. And that kind of can help folks see the light between you know, what they feel really strongly about and like where they're being acculturated into a discriminatory mode. So okay, I'll stop there. Jingy, did you have anything you wanted to say?
The only thing we'll bring up is that we did talk to some students who are closeted still, and so thinking about, you know, like the question of you know, them even wanting to go to the spaces that had trans-specific events. They didn't want to because they're closeted. And thinking about how I approach pronouns, and I think there was a question about what to do in these times where, you know, students might be feeling more vulnerable. I always do pronouns in my class, but I do, you know, I do give several options and say like, you know, if your pronoun is your name, you can say that. You don't have, you know, like try to give people options, because I know that people have really different feelings about you know, about that topic. And also, you know, there's a really specific community history that comes from that, where folks were coming from their job and, you know, like maybe dressed in all different kinds of attire. And I feel like that's really like detached from the way we do it now. So yeah, that's what I want to say.
Thank you all so much. I think there's like some combining that's happening of like the fragments that remain, and I know our time is short, so I'll do my best to yoke together what feels linked. We did have a question, yeah, specifically about how to best support students in a time when it feels very precarious to be out. So I wonder if we can, you know, continue this particular line of thinking and feeling together.
I want to say one thing about that I meant to just make sure we say during this session, which is along the lines of suicide prevention that I mentioned earlier. So a couple of things, like one is that, yeah, people like have good reason to feel that they're facing like an extermination program from the federal government. It's really terrifying. Especially if you don't have decades of living already under a horrible transphobic idea, and then you experience this mainstreaming and thought you're being promised some safety. I think it's really like a lot. You know, maybe you don't have experience knowing that like trans people can keep ourselves and each other alive somewhat. And, you know, we lose a lot of people. But anyway, I feel there's a lot of like reasonable fear. And so it's really, really useful to know. I actually remember a UW Seattle researcher. I went to this celebration of the crisis line in Seattle. Crisis line, something you should know about. Anybody can call it anytime. There's also Trans Lifeline, like knowing these numbers, having these available for students. But this woman was presenting at the crisis line, yeah, where somebody I loved was being honored for their years of service there, as a volunteer answering the phone. And this researcher was saying that the only thing that has ever been shown to actually prevent suicide was carrying messages. Like the only thing that researchers can prove. And that is so profound to me, that like, that's something we can all do, is like, and when people in my life start to disappear, or I'm not hearing from them and I'm worried about them, I just like make a note and just like write them something every week or every day, depending on what our typical communication rhythm was. And just even if they don't write back, I'm thinking of you, I'm sending you a picture of a flower, I hope you're well, I'm here if you want to reach out, so that they don't start to feel like, well, I never reached out to Dean, I can't reach out now. Like just not letting people go. And that includes our students. I think some professors are too like professionally distanced from students. You may be this person's only connection. I feel very comfortable like telling students they can complain to me confidentially about anything in their lives, talking through other issues like their housing or things with their family. And just knowing this is a confidential space, I'm not a trained counselor, but yes, we can absolutely talk about this. If I'm the person you're willing to talk to about this, yes. You know what the lines are. Don't have sex with your students, don't borrow money from them. But yes, then just like be kind to them. Like I feel like people really pull themselves back, and sometimes especially queer and trans faculty pull ourselves back from students, maybe because we're afraid of, all the ways that homophobia and transphobia are used against us. So anyway, being caring, essential. And then the other thing is we want non-carceral responses to mental health crisis. It does not benefit people to be locked up in psychiatric prisons. The abolitionist movement is clear on that. So anything short of that we can do is better. And I don't know what that looks like at UW-Bothell. I don't know how much people are organizing to care for students in non-carceral ways. There's amazing resources about this. I put this in the chat through Interrupting Criminalization. Maybe that group is familiar to some of you. They do a lot of different abolitionist work, but they have some guides on non-carceral responses to mental health crisis. Like, do not call the cops on people. You could get them deported. You can get them, sexually assaulted in the police station. I mean, it's like, so just figuring out together, like, how do we not be alone? Like, oh no, I know this person's really in real danger, but I'm the only one who knows. So how do we create ways to have mutual support through our campus community for students in crisis, trans students included? So I just want to like really encourage that. And the final thing I'll say, mandatory reporter laws. They're not enforced. Do not snitch on people who are having a hard time. This is the way a lot of people get their kids taken away. Like that whole system is terrible. There's brilliant people here in King County trying to work on changing the Washington laws and getting rid of mandatory reporter laws, which have been terrible, especially for families of color. But like, just because you're a mandatory reporter does not mean you need to follow those laws. They aren't enforced. Instead, find out like, how do I really support this person? Including laws inside our campuses, rules inside our campuses. They told us at some point that like if a student identified as ever having experienced sexual violence or assault or abuse, we were supposed to like tell the campus. No, I want students to feel able to tell me about their life and know it's a confidential space and make decisions together about what's the next safe, useful thing for their support. So I just want to really encourage people to move away from rule following towards like pragmatic, support oriented, recognizing the autonomy of students and faculty and staff who we care for, and then also not doing it alone. Like, can we figure out how to support each other while we do it?
Thank you so much. That was so rich and important. And again, I feel bound by the limits of our campus. We have a system for submitting care reports that I'm glad it exists, and I don't think it's probably adequate to the need, and lots of conversation on campus about utilizing that and other systems versus campus safety, which is more of a carceral pathway. So thank you for raising our awareness and keeping us vigilant about those issues, thinking about how to foster relationships that are safe containers where student confidentiality is preserved. It's so important. And again, I appreciate the balance in this conversation between like what policy can do and what policy is needed. And then Dean, like this call for pragmatic choice making around rules and prioritizing student safety. I would like to bring in a question, but maybe shift the emphasis a little bit, given that I think we've talked about some of these issues. So we do have a question specifically around care. And I know there's a lot of work and wisdom in this area on the panel. If we can really kind of be with the current context that's not just anti-trans, but also anti-DEIA, and how that's created a kind of muting on campus. I appreciated, Neil, what you were saying, like a lot of the work that many of us who are part of diversity and equity and structures on campus have noticed, these projects going underground, given how difficult it is to communicate to students who, as you say, are just like looking on the wall to identify resources. Like, how do we get that message of care across, maybe perhaps before we've built that one-on-one relationship with particular students? So again, like how can we provide supporting messages of care in a moment when services and commitments to diversity and equity are being dimmed? Is that a fair way of framing it?
Yeah, I have a thought about this. So as we talked about earlier, Chingy and I, communication about what's actually available for students is part of the issue that a lot of trans students at UW face, like not knowing about the resources that we do have, even with us. Like I wrote down a note that like, we really need to look and see what are the resources that students have here, like in terms of healthcare access, for example. How do they compare to what students have at Seattle? How do they compare to what students have at Tacoma? Because we need to fix that. But that's another question. But I think like, especially first, I know there's a lot of people here who are in the first year and pre-major program. If you're teaching a class that has a lot of first year students, any way you can get them to experience campus physically in some way, like within limits of like understanding that a lot of our students are taking classes online and hybrid and have, challenging schedules. But I have found that that's really, really helpful for helping students actually understand like what's around. So I have an assignment in one of my classes where students have to go to a campus event. Like that's it. That's the assignment. And then they give a like 5-minute little speech about it. Not speech, but they share back with the class. Like, what did I learn? Who organized the event? Like what happened? And I have found that students really hate that assignment, but then they end up really liking it because they're like, oh, I didn't know there was all this stuff, all this free food, that there's a food pantry on campus, that there's a gym on campus, like things that maybe a lot of our students don't know what a college campus has, like in a way that, or presume like what is and isn't there in the way that, we might if you're a traditional student. So yeah, that's something that I think is really important. And I have also found that a lot of students who have like a marginalized identity often go out of their way to like check out the service related to their particular experience. And we get to learn and share about that in our class space. That's one suggestion. Do you have any thoughts, Jean?
I just had one thing that I think I shared with some of the folks on the EIC team is that our kid who goes to high school got a note like shortly after some of the executive orders just saying like, hey, I see you, I care about you, and it was just like a printed note that, just had a signature from the principal. And I was just noting that I felt like on our campus it was just so silent. There was nothing, and I don't think it has to be very complicated. I mean, I think Dean, you said it so well. I think just like, some message that says like, like we care about you, we care what happens, it's a hard time. And I do think, like saying like here are some resources that are supportive. Yeah.
Thank you, Chingy. We have just a couple minutes remaining, so I want to invite our other panelists, maybe around this question of care and how you'd like to round out our time together today.
There's a few things that I just cannot not say having a King County Council member here. Something that would benefit all of us greatly would be to close the King County Jail. It's one of the deadliest jails in the United States. It's been a focus of campaigns of all of our communities for years. And at least to reinstate the booking restrictions that were instated after 2020. Basically, I don't know if most people in this room know this, but the county and city have just gone deeply backwards from the things that we won through our uprising in 2020. And we are now living under like an increasingly kind of, I mean, for me, because I lived in New York, and then I like think of it as like a Giuliani style, it's anti-poor, extremely racist, extremely anti-sex worker and drug user regime. And we need the leadership of people like Jorge and to change that. And also like for us to really get the county and city councils to do things, we need to like have intense pressure on them, because otherwise then it's just like one voice within any of those councils. And we've had a lot of that over the years, where that even when people try to do good in those spaces, there's so much pressure from the cops themselves, the real estate interests, all of the things that run the US cities. I don't have a lot of hope in the changes to municipal governance in the United States, but I feel like I have seen over the years that mass organizing in cities like Seattle has occasionally given some relief to some of these incredibly horrifying regimes. I mean, and Seattle and King County have continued to expand policing and criminalization over the years in so many ways. They should also close down the youth jail, which Dow Constantine promised would be closed in 2020, just a few months after it was opened. These things are really in reach and things the county council and city council could actually do. So all of us, I mean, our students are the ones who are getting arrested and ending up in there and dying. So this is like utterly related to our work on campus. There's no difference. And especially people working at public colleges and universities, I'd say your students are even more likely to be vulnerable. So I hope that we can all get behind those, like that bigger picture that we're living in that's really dangerous and deadly.
Thank you, Dean. Definitely heard you on those comments. I just want to close with my gratitude to everybody for being here and continued engagement. I think we're gonna, I will say that I feel like we're gonna have a lot of challenges coming up with the federal government. I think that I think there's going to be continued attacks, and I think there's going to be moments when I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on state and local governments to fold. And I think that engagement at the state and local level is going to be really important. So I hope all of you will continue to be engaged in these conversations, and I'm really grateful to be part of the conversation today.
Yeah, thank you all. I again want to echo that message of gratitude to everyone for being here today. As we've talked a lot in this panel about active allyship, a step towards active allyship is, seeking spaces like these to learn, to seek out resources of how to help your students. So I really see you all who are here and admire and appreciate this step you're taking today. And I think I would like to close out with just that resounding message of care and compassion in these times. That work to creating loving spaces where you can is so vital because, as you know, Dean has brought to the table, we as the trans community, we have learned and we can help each other survive, right? And we have that ability, we have that power, but we do need the support of our wider community, right? And so the loving support that you can give in spaces where you can create welcome and inclusivity is so vital. And I appreciate you all for being in this space together in this step towards loving inclusivity. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Luna. I really cherish the time with you today, and I'd like for you to be our last word. So thank you for everyone here. I appreciate all the caring sign-offs in the chat. I hope we can continue to meet and to strategize and to shelter each other. Thank you so much.